Hello Internet, we're back with a few more tips. I got 3 more for you. We had some good response in this video, so I wanted to kind of keep this going and add a little more fun to this, what looks like is a series now. What I want to start with is we did something in the last video, and if you haven't watched the last one, definitely check it out. Links in the description. But we did something in here where we kind of played with this idea of responsive components, which is a really nice handy thing. And just to remind you kind of how it works, we'll open up chapter 5 and we'll see in here we had this idea of a base component, and the base component itself will essentially use our screen utils to determine what the size is and send back an enum of the screen size. And from there, we do our build where we check the screen size and we actually return back these methods here. And these methods are ones that you override to be able to have a different version, maybe doing something in a column versus a row, a grid versus a, just a list view, that kind of thing. Lots of different options here. Just a nice, great pattern because in the implementation, all we have to do is sort of override these things, and we don't have to override them all. We can just override body, and these ones by default will use that. Okay, so I just flew through that really quick. Of course, if it doesn't make sense, watch the video before. I just want to remind you what we're doing. Because what I'd like to show you now is how we can do this for a screen and add a bit more really nice functionality and developer experience. And this is something I do on many of my apps. I do want to point out one thing in the comments, and we're actually going to make this fix right now. We were doing something where we were doing media query of context. And a couple of people in the comments, actually I think a few, pointed out, hey, it's actually better if you do size of context. Get rid of size here so that this doesn't trigger a rebuild when different things change, like maybe a screen orientation or anything to do with media query, going from dark mode to light mode, that kind of stuff. So we're going to make that change here just so we have it for the future. Also, because we're going to be doing this in, we're going to be using another file now to access this, I'm actually going to move these to its own folder, which is something I mentioned we should do anyways. So actually not a folder, let's just make a new file called screenutils.dart. And we'll just paste this here. We'll import material, and we'll just make sure that we're using this. That way we can use it in another file without duplicating our code. And let's just save everything, and let's just make sure everything's still working here. So we'll go back to here, and it looks like we're back in good shape. So we're just using colors as the example here, but of course you can, do this in a more practical way of how you want to maybe arrange your content. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, let's go to chapter 10. And what I want to do here is kind of do something similar. We had that base component. We're going to make something called base screen. So I'm going to do a stateless widget called base screen. And it's going to similarly have this sort of body thing, which we're going to grab just from chapter 5. Of course, this would be something you would probably want to put in your own code in its own file as well. But for demo purposes and keeping this simple, we're just going to put this here. So we'll have the same idea that we did for a base component, but this is a base screen, so we want to do a little bit more here. Instead, what we're going to return is a scaffold from here. And we're going to basically make its body, and here we're going to essentially have that same code that we used here. So I'm actually just going to grab this, grab all of this here, and in our body we're actually just going to do a builder here, where we do builder, and context is the parameter, and we'll just paste that in right here, and of course import this. We need a semicolon, and everything should be pretty. So now we have this thing of base screen, so let's actually use this here. And now we're going to change this to body because we are overriding this, and we're not going to return a scaffold anymore. Instead, we're just going to return text maybe of hello, and let's make it really nice and put it in a center. All right, so let's go back to our app now, and we'll go to chapter 10. We'll actually see we have this lovely hello here. It is in a scaffold, and the problem is we kind of have a bit of a, you can get back if you grab enough, but obviously this isn't very workable for us because we need an app bar and maybe some other things. So let's figure out how we could do that. So now in here, I'm going to add something called app bar. So it's going to return an app bar that's technically nullable, and we'll just call this app bar. Now we do have to oh, sorry, capital B there. And here we're going to pass in the context, of course. And by default, this will just return null in here. Now, what we want to do in our scaffold here is say appbar is going to be equal to appbar, the function we made, passing in context. Nothing's going to change, but if we go to our implementation of this in our body function, because we're implementing extending base screen, we can also override the appbar functionality. And here, maybe on the screen, we want to return an appbar. Let's just give it a title of text that says chapter 10. So now we actually get that app bar here, which is pretty cool. And instead of, us having to make a scaffold and all this stuff, we can kind of keep things, in this sort of way. Similarly, maybe we want to do the same for something like a floating action button, something that's usually present on not all screens, but certain screens. So floating action button, and we'll just call it the same name, camel case. We want to make sure that context gets passed in. And again, we're going to return null. The reason we're passing context in here, we're not actually using it here, but we want to make sure in the implementation of all these things, we have access to context, because you might want to be doing a media query. You might want to be getting a translation, all these kinds of things that will require context. So similarly, I can just now go and override floating action button. Action button. And did I, floating action button? Maybe I spelled something wrong. There we go. And here, it's giving me an error because we're returning an app bar from here. Oh, that's why we have the problem here. This needs to return a floating action button. And what we want to do is now return a floating action button. And on pressed, we can do something, obviously. And let's just give it a child of an icon, icons.add. And in order for this to show up, we go back to our base screen, and of course we need to pass in floating action button, and we'll just do floating action button, pass the context. So basically this scaffold is going to go, hey, okay, I'm going to run this function, essentially, cool, and oh, I'm getting nothing back. And this can be null, right? These are allowed to be null. Same with the app bar, floating action button, null. It's a widget, cool. So there, floating action button, awesome. And now let's actually save. And we'll see it's right there. There it is. Doesn't do anything, but it is there, which is nice. We can do the same thing with, a bottom sheet. Basically, any of the things that Scaffold has, we could, of course, override and make work. So yeah, this is just a really nice pattern, because now when we're making screens, we can kind of keep them organized in this way. And we do still have the ability to, I can make this body MD, and just make this, maybe we can fit more exclamation marks now. So you kind of get the best of both worlds here. We have hello, just one exclamation mark. We get big, they do. So yeah, everything is cool, and this, works really nicely for me. All right, so that was chapter 10, if you're following along from the last one. Chapter 11, what I want to talk about here is, let's go back and see what chapter 11 is, dialogue animations. So this is a cool thing. We obviously have in Flutter the ability to show a dialogue or like a bottom modal sheet. And by default, there's this bit of an animation, I think, that happens in an alert. It kind of like fades in slightly. But I can show you now how we can override those things. So let's open up chapter 11 and let's do some exciting things here. So first of all, let's just get this set up for our use. So we're going to have body. Let's just have a center. We're going to have a child of an elevated button. The on pressed is what we'll get to in a bit. But let's give it a child of text that just says, tap me. And let's just make sure everything's good. So we have a nice tap me button here. Okay, so I just want to show something real quick. So we have the show dialog right here. This is built into material, into Flutter, and it kind of shows, I guess just to, in case you've never used this before, let's just see. A lot of the time you'll return what's called an alert dialog here. And you can give things like a title, maybe text, hello, and we can give it content, text, hello again, and you can give it actions and a few other things. So let's just see what that actually looks like by default. So you can kind of see it does like fade in, and that's still nice that happens out of the box. But we can actually do some things to make this really cool and animate it in a fun way. So what can we do here? So let's just look at the show dialog implementation. If we actually open it up, we'll actually go through and see all the stuff about it. And somewhere in this mix, there is a function being called show general dialog, which maybe it's actually in a different file. And show general dialog is what's being used under the hood and has a lot more options we can actually override. So I'm going to get rid of this code here. And instead, we're going to, just to make this a little bit easier to take in and keep it outside of our widget tree, we're going to make a function. It's going to return a future of a bool. And we'll just call it show my dialog so it's not confusing. And we're going to expect the build context to be passed in. And we're also going to, and I'll make this a named parameter, we're going to have a widget that we can pass in so we can use this for different things. And maybe some more stuff, some more options in a bit, but let's just get the basic stuff out of the way. So what I want to do is we're going to go show general dialog like I was showing you, and just kind of have this ready. And there's a few different things we can do. So first of all, the page builder, this is essentially the widget that's going to show up once the animation is completed. So in here, we have a parameter of context. We also have animation 1 and animation 2. You can call these whatever you want. And here we need to just kind of return what that will be at the end. And we're going to just do the child that gets passed in here as what shows up. Some other things we want to do and override is, because we're not using just the show dialog, there's some defaults we want to set. So for instance, we need to have barrier dismissible to true. This makes it so that when you click outside of it, it dismisses it, assuming that's the case that you want. However, when you have barrier dismissible true, you also have to have a barrier label, which I think is more for accessibility than anything, but we'll just make it an empty string. Otherwise, we'll get an assertion error. Now, the other two things we need a transition duration. And here, let's just do a duration of, milliseconds 300, customize that to however you want. And then we can have a transition builder. And this is where the magic is going to happen. So we're going to have a context. Again, we're going to have animation 1, animation 2, and we're going to have something called widget here. Okay. So what I want to do now is just make sure that we don't forget to call this. Let's actually just call this show my dialog, and we need to pass in context, and we need to pass in a widget. So I'm just going to make a simple sort of thing here. Let's just have literally text like we've been doing all day. Oops, sorry. We need to actually say child text of hello. Now this would be the contents of your alert, essentially, of your message that comes up. Hello world, and I'm just going to wrap it in some padding here just to give it some breathing room. So this won't work yet because we do need our transition builder to be in place. So let's get that in order. Now this probably looks familiar to you if you've done some stuff with route transitions. It allows you to sort of customize the transition between two states. And what we're going to start with is just a nice little fun one that at least in a professional app you probably never use, but I find it's pretty fun. And we're just going to return a transform. Actually a transform.rotate. And here we need to put in our angle, and we're going to have to import math in order to do this. So we're actually going to import specifically vector math. So we're going to go package vector math, vector math. This is built in. You don't have to install this, or it's at least a dependency of Flutter, so you will already have it. And we're just going to cast it as math so that we can kind of use it as math. So now we can go right here. We can say math dot radians. And what we want to pass in is whatever the animation value is right now, but multiply it by 360. And this essentially will convert it to the way that this needs to happen. So basically this animation value is going to update as over this course of these 300 milliseconds, and we'll be able to essentially rotate this as needed. Now, just doing that is not going to be enough because we also need to have what's being rotated, and we'll put our child in here. And what we want to do is we don't just want to take the child we're passing in, we actually want to pass in a alert dialog. And here, we'll do our content being the child. I'm also going to do just something where we can set our content padding on that alert dialog just to 0. So we can do content padding edge insets.0. And there's one more padding I want to do, inset padding. And this just makes it so that it doesn't take up, there's not some spacing automatically on this, and we kind of have full control of what it will look like. Now I'm getting this error here, and that's because I want this has to return a bool. So we're actually, and this could be considered even a separate tip, but we're going to make something called result equals await. We're going to await this because what we can also do in here is maybe let's wrap this in a column. And let's just also put maybe a row here with some children, and we'll have a text button that says on pressed, we're going to go navigator dot of context dot pop. And in our pop, we can actually pass a value in, and I'm going to pass false here. It can really be any value. It's a dynamic value, but we're going to do that. And then similarly, or sorry, we also need this to say, let's just say no. We'll think of this as like a, you know, confirmation sort of thing. And let's do the same thing here, but we'll have, you know, yes, and make it true. And that way we'll pop true. That way what's coming back from here essentially is going to be either true or false. Now that's not always the case. If the barrier is dismissible, you'll actually get a null back. So what we really want to return, we don't just want to return this result, we want to return, you know, the result equaling true. That way, even if it's null, basically null will be, you know, counted as false. And that'll allow us to do some fun things. For instance here, we can await, we can make, you know, a final val equals this. And, you know, this is helpful for like a confirmation dialog, because then at the very end of this await, you can actually go, you know, if, sorry, wrong spot. Where does this end? Let's get our alert dialog. There it is. So right here, we can go do some logic, you know, to actually go if result, what do we call this? If val equals true. And in fact, we can go if val, because we know this will be, we know this will return a Boolean. We can say, you know, print, yay, else print no. All right. There we have it. So before we actually see this in action, just a quick review. We're essentially using show general dialog instead of show dialog, because it allows us to edit the page builder. It allows us to do these transition stuff, and so on and so forth. And we are, you know, returning a result from here just so we can actually make use of this. So hopefully there's no typos, and let's just see if this works. Tap me. There we go. Now there's one little thing I want to fix here that I was thinking of is we made a column, but I actually want this to be main axis size dot min, because I was just trying to take up as much space as possible. There we go. We have this and this. So we can click yes, and you'll actually see we got yay back down here, and we can click no, and we get no. So everything's cool. And if I cancel it, meaning I just click somewhere else, or even push the escape key if you're on a computer, or even yeah, if you're on something with a keyboard, we actually get that no back because we're casting it essentially to say it has to be actually true to come back true. So that's a pretty cool cool effect there. Something bothering me is I do want this row's main axis alignment dot end. This will just put those buttons kind of at this side, which is what you'd expect usually in a sort of confirmation window. So this isn't the prettiest thing in the world because I spent 5 seconds on it, but you get the idea, and the animation's cool. You know, like I said, probably not in a professional app. But let's look at some other options we could do here. In order to do this, and for me to have code that you guys can, you know, see in my GitHub without it being like commented out, what we're also going to do now is we're actually going to create an enum here. And we'll call it dialog transition type. And right now we just did one called, let's call it spin. And we can actually, in this builder, we can actually switch on a value that we're going to pass in. So let's pass that in here. We'll have a required this. We'll just call it type. So we can now switch on that type. And we'll just put this all the way down like that. And let's do case, what do we call this thing? Dialog transition type dot spin, and here we return this. Now we do have an error because we do have to now pass in the type, so let's do type and dialog transition type dot spin. So what's cool about doing it this way for our purposes is now we can actually have a different type. So let's make a second one. Let's call it zoom. We're going to do a zoomy one, and we'll see now we have an error here, so let's actually handle that case. Now for zoom, what we're going to do instead is, instead of doing a transform.rotate, we're going to do a transform.scale. And in here, we are going to make its opacity, sorry, it's scale, not opacity. We're going to use the animation 1.value. So we don't have to do any this one we kind of had to do some math on it to be like, give me the degrees based on this. Here, we're just going to use the animation value. It's going to start at 0, and over the course of these 300 milliseconds, it's going to get to 1. So it'll be tiny, and then it will get big. That's kind of the idea here. And here, I can just take really the same child here and do this. So let's see how that one works. Now, did we change this? I don't think so. Let's make sure we change it. So instead of spin, we're going to make this zoom. And now if we tap, we get this nice little zoom effect. Woo! That's kind of cool. It's zooming in. Great. Let's do one more, because why not? This one is, I'm going to call this drop. And this one's one of the coolest looking ones, I think, that I could come up with. And, you know, frankly, also based on some articles I found. But here, this one's a little bit more complicated. But what we're going to do is this one will have some easing in it, so it kind of has like a little bouncy effect in it. So we actually have to make a curve for this. So we're going to make something called curved value. And I realize I need to make this not say zoom, but let's make this say drop. And here we're going to take our curves, which is something just built into probably into Flutter. Let's actually see what it comes from. Yep, it comes from the animation part of Flutter. Curves dot, and we're going to use, let's use ease, in, out, back. And here, we're going to use a transform on it. And for the transform value, we'll take animation1.value, but we're going to subtract 1.0 from it. Okay, so that's sort of our curve animation. And here, we're going to return a transform. But instead of using one of our transform, instead of using these sort of like helper constructors here, we're going to build this one from scratch. So our transform is going to, we can pass in our own transform. It's going to be a matrix4.transform translation values. And here we need to pass in the x, y, and z. So we're going to use 0 for the x, because we actually don't want to move on the x. In my case, this is going to be something that drops from the bottom, drops from the top. For y, though, we're going to use curve value. We're going to multiply by 200, just a magic number that I felt looked good when I figured this out. And z, which is kind of like, you know, coming towards you, coming away from you, let's just keep that as a constant of 0. You could, of course, animate any of these in a combination of them. Then we're going to do a child. And we're going to make this one a little bit more exciting, where we also have an opacity inside of it. And the opacity, we're going to use animation1.value as well. So we're going to be both kind of like animating its position, essentially, and its opacity at the same time. Then we're just going to take this exact same child thing here to save some time and paste it in. Okay, so let's try this out. Let's change this to drop. And you get this nice little blue blue. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. It has this little bounce. It's kind of nice. You can still do everything the same way. So building something like this, you know, this is something that you could, you know, make a library yourself in your own app that you can just pass in different types of transitions and obviously the child and get these cool, you know, sort of effects. So there we go. That was tip number 11. Tip number 12. This is a super useful one. It's not as fun as this, you know, stuff right here that I could just click on all day, but it is very useful. And we're going to essentially get into it right now. So what do we call this one? App flavors. So app flavors, also known as like environments. This is kind of just something you especially need if you have like a production server, a staging server. That's one good use case for it. Another good use case is, and I've done this on some projects, where I actually ship kind of like different versions of an app to different clients, to different partners, that kind of stuff that we want to just configure, you know, in one spot. What version, what flavor of this app is it? And we're not going to manage multiple code bases. We're just going to have this one setting. So let's talk about how to do that. So we're going to start, and I'm going to install a package that I like. It's called flutter.env. So we'll just do, and remember, we are using FVM here. If you're not familiar with Flutter Version Manager, watch, you know, my first video. I think that was the very first chapter of this. So we can go FVM flutter pub add, and we are going to add flutter_.env. Now we are adding a new package that has some nativeness to it, as well as we're going to be updating our pub spec with some assets. So I'm actually going to stop building or stop running the app, because we will have to do a full rebuild. Okay, so now we have this thing. The other thing I want to set up is essentially in our root, we're going to make a new folder called assets. And inside here, we're going to make a new folder, and we'll just call this env. where environment files will go. And we're going to make one called develop env. And let's make one called prod env. And of course, you could have as many as you want. This is also something that, at least when I'm working with other people and whatnot, I don't version control these files because they are kind of like a configuration you want to control yourself in your own environment, especially the develop one. You wouldn't want that version controlled if you're working with someone else. They might have different, settings on their computer that you need to change. So this is something you might want to git ignore and then have like an example version in it to make sure that other people know how to use it. Okay, so we have these sort of env files, and let's just put some stuff in these. So develop env, we're going to set a setting called name. Its name is going to be develop, and then we're going to have something called cool API public key. So this could be like an API key, again, a public API key for some service we're using, or even our own backend or something like that. So we have those for develop. And let's have, similarly, we want to keep the same names. We have name and cool public API key, but we're going to make these slightly different for prod. We're going to call it prod, and we're going to call it, foobar prod. I do want to reiterate, or I think I've probably said this before in videos, or at least on Reddit and stuff, like anything with environment variables and whatnot, no matter how secure you're making it or you think you're making it, it's never secure. You should never have anything like an AWS secret key in somewhere like this. This is meant for public stuff, which is why I purposely put the word public here so people don't get confused and go, that's not secure. Because anything that is in your app, you don't own the app. Assuming you have at least one other user, they own the app. They're the ones who can, essentially look at network inspector sniffing and decompile your code and look for stuff. There's nothing secure but a client-side app. If you need anything that is like a secret, like an AWS secret or many others out there, you need a backend. You need a proxy, essentially. You need something that is going to be stored on, and your service, your app talks to that, and the server itself goes off to talk to that. So just a little side note there, just a little bonus tip, I guess. Don't put anything secret in these. It's never going to be secure. There's just not possible. It's just not possible to be secure unless you never release your app. Then it's pretty secure. Okay, so I have these things set up, which is nice. And the reason I want to get that out of the way is because we're going to go to our pub spec, and we are going to go to wherever we have the assets here. And I'm just going to uncomment this right here. And we'll make this a assets/env with a trailing slash. And that'll actually import and allow us to use anything in this folder without having to put each of these individually. Okay, now that those two things are good, we can actually rebuild this. So I'm just going to, let's go to our main.dart, and we will just click run and just get this building in the background as we start going. Okay, so what I want to do now is essentially set up a way to configure these, to read these settings based on a flavor. So I'm just going to, for the sake of this, put it in here. We're just going to call it I'll just call it env.dart. Oops, there we go. And of course, it's now a .d file, which we're not going to use. So we're going to change it to env.dart. All right. So inside here, what I want to do is define different app flavor options that we have. And we'll make an enum called app flavor. And we're going to have one called develop and one called prod, just like that. Now, we're going to make use of some of the somewhat newer stuff in Dart 3 whatever when this came out, where our enums can have a bit more functionality with them. We're going to allow our enums, each property of it, to have a config path. So we'll do config path here, and then we actually have to give our enum a constructor, and it has to be a const constructor, so we'll do const this, and we go this.config path. Now we're getting these errors here because it's expecting us actually to construct these with some values. So here, our config path for environment develop would be assets/env/develop env. Now, you might be wondering, why am I calling these? You could do, in theory, you could do develop.env and prod.env. And that I would prefer doing it that way. However, what I ran into a long time ago in the past, and I don't think this is something you can fix because it's probably a browser-based thing, your browser won't open those files and if it's .env at the end. So this would work fine on iOS and Android and everything like that. But because this has to get fetched essentially through your, in Chrome through a network request, because it's just an external, it's just an asset essentially, it won't read them. So that's why I call them _env instead of .env. Just a side note. And if you want to do .env, go for it. Just note in web, you're going to run into a problem. So we'll just do prod env, and that's just, references to these files. All All right, so we have our different flavors now. We're also going to import that package that we installed a few minutes ago, .env. Now, what I want to do in this file, and I can do this anywhere, so let's actually do it right at the top, because this might be something we want to come into often and change these. We're going to have something called app flavor. Flavor is going to be equal to app flavor dot, and let's start with develop. We're developing. Let's start with our develop version. Okay, so that's all configured and set. And the idea is you could come into this file and just change this, rebuild, and you'll get all the different settings, which is nice. So let's make a class called env. And this is going to be essentially a static class. This isn't something we need. It's not going to have state. It's not really needs to be a singleton or anything. So we're just going to use static methods on it. We're going to have an init function, which will be asynchronous. And in here, what we want to do is essentially await, and we have to use our .env. This is what we just installed. .env .load, and here we need to pass in the config path. Okay, and of course, for now, we could keep this really simple, and we could just go, okay, we already know we can use our flavor, and we can say flavor .config path. Oh, there's one. Sorry, this is a name parameter of file name, and then flavor.config path, and that will work, and that's great. So we'll get that going, and then the idea is, because we're using these strings in this file, right? We have like these. We don't ever in our app, aside from in one centralized place, we don't want to be copying and pasting and using this value throughout our app. It's easy to make a typo that way. It's easy to. You don't really get also the any type safety. It doesn't really know what this is or if it exists. So what I like to do now underneath this is we're going to make a static function that will return a string. It's going to be a getter called name. And this just correlates essentially with, if we open this up over here, this name value. And here what we want to do is you want to return, here we go, .env. I said .env, but then a period env. That's funny. And here we just want to make sure we're, this is the one place we copy and paste and make sure everything's good. Now you'll see that we're getting an error here because this might not exist. We're actually returning something nullable, so we need to have a default here. And I like to, in certain cases, use unset, unless there's a good reason where some environments don't have this, in which case, yeah, return a nullable string. But here we'll always know that this will be a string. It'll be maybe develop, it might be prod, or it might be unset. Either way, we have something. Similarly, let's do this. And maybe in this case, let's actually not make it return a string. This is going to return a nullable string. And we're going to grab that cool API public key right there. And I'm not going to fall back to something here. We're just going to allow it to be null. Okay, so let's go to chapter 12 now. One more thing we need to do. We made this amazing init function here. It's very basic, but it needs to happen before we ever access something. So in our main.dart, we're going to make our run, or our main function, asynchronous. And before we actually run app, we're going to go await env.init. And this essentially will initialize the .env package to read that file and be ready to go. Okay, so let's just do a green arrow rebuild and bring up our app. And let's go to 12. And we don't have anything here yet, but let's get some stuff here. So let's go into our body and let's actually make, maybe we make a column. And it's going to have some children. And let's have a list tile. And its title is going to be a text. And we're actually going to use our environment. So let's open this up and remember how it works. We're going to put env.name. Now we need to make sure we import this. So we're just importing our own little file here. And let's just also give this a subtitle. We'll just call it like text flavor name. And let's just see how this works. So we have, develop being the flavor name. Similarly, let's make one env.cool API key, and you'll see we're getting this error here because this could be null. So in this case, we could actually just wrap this whole thing in, if env.cool API key does not equal null, then, we do this, or whatever logic you would want here. Just wanted to show you one other option. And, of course, this can be used for bools and stuff too. To do that, what you would want to do is maybe have something called like is develop, or let's do debug mode. That's a pretty common one. And let's do in develop debug mode equals true, just like that. And in prod, I'm actually going to omit it completely because we'll actually do a default here. So let's make a static bool get debug mode. And here we actually want to return, I'll just copy this here, and copy this. And we want to not return the value in here because that's actually a string. Everything in our .env is going to be a string. We're actually going to be getting essentially true as a string back. So what we want to actually check is it equal to true, like this. This could be null in the case of production or not. So let's save that and let's do one more. It'll be kind of like this. And we'll just go if env.debug mode, and now it's not doesn't equal null, we're just checking a boolean, right? This is going to be a boolean, and we could just say debug mode, and in this case this will only show up, so we don't have to put the value here. We can say yes. Okay, so let's just see that all in action. I'm just going to do a green arrow rebuild because we do have some more values in here that need to be bootstrapped, and we'll go 12. And we see we're in debug mode. Okay, there's our foobar develop API key and so on and so forth. And if I, of course, change this to prod, and for anything with your env, because of this init function, we actually have to rebuild, just a green arrow rebuild. You don't have to stop the, you don't have to like completely stop the app. It's pretty quick. And there we have prod, we have the API key here, and we don't even see this because we were checking this. So that's how we do that. All that's great, and this works awesome for development and stuff. But what about if you're, deploying this and you don't want to accidentally deploy the wrong thing, like you're deploying to web, and you want to be able to do some continuous integration or so on and so forth? What we can actually do is use Dart define to essentially set these. So for this, what we're going to do is I'll set up the launcher.json first. So let's go in VS Code to our run and debug, and if we click this little settings gear here, we'll actually be given this launch.json, this new sort of file. I'm going to remove these ones, and we're going to call this develop. Okay, now what we can do is not only just say like what what kind of mode we're doing and stuff, but we can actually pass some args. So we're going to make another variable called args, and this will be a list that we need to pass in. The first argument, although is really kind of just not an argument itself, but the name of the argument is going to be Dart define. And the second one is we actually pass in something, I'm going to call it flavor equals develop. So this is the same way as running, like Flutter run -- Dart define space flavor equals this. So we're just defining a variable, but we're doing it in this launch.json, and you'll see why that's pretty cool. Let's make one for prod, and here we would just make this say prod. And let's do one more fun one here. We'll have prod, and if we wanted to actually build to web, and this is just a bonus tip right here, we can actually pass in some other things, and I like to do this first. We can do -d, and for -d, we're going to have Chrome. We're going to say, hey, launch this in Chrome. And another fun tip I like, especially when you're dealing with something that has like authentication or cookies or something that, every time you relaunch, you lose all that because it's going to run it on a new port. We can actually set the web port here so that it always uses the same web port in this configuration. And let's just do 42069, of course, because we are a bunch of teenagers. Awesome. So I just have these set up, and what's cool is over here now in our mode, we can actually switch between these. We can go prod web, develop, all that kind of stuff. You can make as many as you want. You can set ones for Mac, Windows, whatever. Just follow this sort of convention. Now, just doing this alone isn't enough. We obviously need to let our env file essentially check that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to make a static getter. It's going to return a string, and it's going to be called, we're just going to call it config path. And what we can do in here is we can actually get a flavor override, as I'm going to call it. So we'll just call it flavor override, and we're going to be going string.fromEnvironment flavor, and that's essentially mapping to this right here. Now the way you'll notice this is a constant. Anything from environment is a constant, and it's a string, and it will never be null. Even if we don't pass something through, this will never be null. It'll just be an empty string. So that's important to note when you're dealing with environment variables in this sort of way. Then what we can essentially do is we can switch on our flavor override, and we can do a case for develop. Just make sure that these match develop right here. And what we can do is return app flavor.develop.config path. Then let's have a case for prod. Make sure that we said prod here. We did. And we're going to just essentially return the same thing. except this will be prod. And then we're going to have a default. And the default, we're just going to return basically what we're doing here. So we're going to return this. So I'm going to copy this. Actually, I'll cut it out. We'll return this. And then here, all we do is we pass in config path. So it's going to run this getter. And the reason I'm using a getter instead of a function is we don't have to pass any arguments in. So it's just cleaner and nicer to do it as a getter like that. Okay, so now I'll just refresh. Nothing's going to change yet because we need to actually rebuild this, but let's just make sure everything's still working. We have our flavors, cool. Okay, so I'm going to stop this app and we're going to go over here and yeah, let's set prod. And I'm just going to change it to prod and click play. And let's just let that build. All right, we're all built. Let's go to our app flavors and we see the prod environment stuff. So yeah, again, just a great bonus tip on top of this tip, you know, especially for things like continuous integration, or if you're using make files to like deploy something to Firebase. The reason I started doing it this way is I made mistakes before where I would deploy to like the production server with the staging flavor set because I was stupid, which is a huge pain in the ass because you got to like revert it back really quickly. But if you didn't notice it, you could have, you know, major problems on your hands. So doing it like this, I can actually put in my make file that Dart define and run it, and I can just safely know, yeah, it's going to use this environment no matter what this is set to. And that's the idea here. So there we go. That was what, tip number 12. All right. Thanks for watching. Any suggestions like last time, throw them in the comments. I'd love to learn some more and improve this series. So please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.